So I know that all four of you, and you've been involved in local church ministry as well over the years, but the four of you have been involved in small town ministry specifically. I was wondering if some of you, one or two of you to start things off, might want to share what led you to serve in the small places, and what advice would you give to those of us serving in small places now?
I'll go. I was not aiming for a small town. I think quite a lot like Donnie, I was aiming for a big city because I had heard a certain narrative of ministry success. I had heard it actually growing up in a small town. No one ever explicitly expressed to me that to be successful, I would need to get away from my town, but it was enough in the kind of air of the culture that I, even as kind of a late teen, developed a success rating in my mind for myself and my classmates, and it was the really successful ones would go far from my hometown, tiny little town in north central Maine, and would wind up in a big city. The further away and the bigger, the more successful. And I lived that for about 10 or 15 years. That was the trajectory I was on. The way I wound up in a small town was by being called very clearly and undeniably to a small town church. It's kind of a package deal. If you get called to a small town church, you need to go to a small town. So I did not get into small town ministry because I felt drawn to small towns. It's been just the opposite. It's actually been going to a church that happened to be in a small town and seeking to love the people in that church and then just neighbor with people and begin to be part of the community so it's not something that's totally separate and apart from me. I've fallen in love with the small place I've been in. And I say to people, I think small towns are often like Mary Poppins' handbag. They're bigger on the inside than on the outside. You know what I mean? So if you're looking at it from the outside, it just seems small and uninteresting. But the deeper in you go and the deeper in relationship you grow with people, the more riches there are to see and experience.
Donnie, I know that you wrote an article about small town ministry being like a fishbowl, and that there's benefits to that because everybody sees you, and there's struggles to that because everybody sees you. Can you give a little bit more about that, and maybe share a little bit about the joys and the struggles that come along with that fishbowl mentality?
Yeah, so that is a challenge, but it's also an opportunity. The challenge is when you do just need some space. That's a challenge because it's very hard to get it. That's just the reality. Everywhere I go, I know people, and everywhere I go, people feel the freedom because I'm a pastor to just come up and talk, And then I eventually got the word out that Monday was my day off, and so all that means now is people go, "Oh, I know it's your day off," but like that's all that changed is like this. I know it's your day off preface.
Come to a conference.
Yeah, so I'm having a great day off right now with you guys. But date night has been the biggest challenge, to be honest. My wife and I have just really struggled over the last 10 years to just find, and so it's incredible that people, we were on a date one time and someone pulled up a chair. There's a candle between me and my wife. They pulled up a chair and they said, "Hey, my marriage is on the rocks, Pastor." And I was like, are you trying to bring me into your situation? Do you want my marriage to be on the rocks? Like, we're clearly having a moment, man. Like, it's romantic. Like, get out of here, And so we've had to drive, far distances, not because we don't want to support our local businesses. We very much do want to do that. But because we just need some space, And so, anyway, that's been a challenge. But, my wife has encouraged me with how if you look at the ministry of Jesus, it's really a ministry of interruptions. All of our favorite stories are moments where Jesus was interrupted. On the way to do something, no doubt, very important. And God, that just ministered to me. It helped me. It humbled me. Who am I to think that my life needs all these boundaries? And it's 5 o'clock. I'm off. Don't you know that? pour your heart out some other time during business hours kind of thing. Like I've just started to kind of just embrace it a little bit and go, God, teach me how to have moments of real deep rest. But man, this is an incredible opportunity that, that you get to know so many people and see so many people, and everywhere you go, you're getting a chance to preach, as it were, by the way that you're living your life,
How about the rest of you guys? Joys and struggles of small town ministry. What stands out to you?
I just shared joys for me. So the first pastor I had was 10 years in, and it led me to be on staff at a big church in York, Pennsylvania, which was large and had a great resume. I was there for 5 years, and I was ready to go south and get my own swimming pool and a church, in that order. Really carnal. Jesus called us back to New Hampshire, and the greatest joy is baptizing new believers. If you love Jesus and you love your church and you love lost people, last year we baptized 8 new believers, and we're a church of 80. And this year we got 3 lined up for Easter. And I'm not an evangelist. It's just God's people loving on people. And so, that, someone said earlier, I can't remember which of the speakers said this, but, that someone comes to Jesus, that matters. And so at the end of the day, that kind of like keeps my tank full. And when we started the church, I used to do the sniff test. If I couldn't meet a lost person on a Sunday morning in church, it was like we weren't church. Like 30 people worshiping Jesus should attract something. And so that's one of my greatest joys.
Hey, can I just jump in too as well, Ben? I'm not sure if you said this as we were coming up or not, but some of you know that David Pinckney is a co-director of the new Acts 29 Rural Collective Church Planting Initiative. This is one of the things Donnie was just saying. It seems like small town, rural emphasis is getting some traction, and it's very encouraging. And one of the encouraging developments to me is that Acts 29, which has been known as kind of an urban thrust for church planting, cares enough about rural church planting to launch this new initiative just in the last, what is it, David, like the last 5 or 6 months, 4 or 5 months. I think it would be helpful just from that perspective. You're traveling all over. You're in Saskatchewan next week, and Indianapolis, and then Malawi, right, in the next 3 or 4 weeks. And you've already been traveling a lot. So what are you seeing in these early days, even in your travels, in terms of the joys and the hardships of rural church planting, even from kind of a global perspective? You're not just in the U.S., you're all over.
The greatest joy is to discover there's a lot of people out there like us doing this. The discouragement is it's hard everywhere. Rural pastor buddy of mine in rural Australia, there's a lot of wealth there. That's just kind of odd, but that's a hard place. And then with guys in the north coast of Hawaii, trying the lostness there is just as real as anywhere, and they're bivocational, swinging a hammer. And so that's the joy is God is calling people to small places all over. Going to be in Canada later this week, and the network there, one of their concerns is we don't have any, we don't know of a lot of people going to rural places in Canada to plant churches. And so we're just trying to stir the pot. So that's encouraging. They invited us up there to stir the pot. The discouraging part is, and I say discouraging, it's not discouraging, it's hard work. But we rest forever, so let's just get about it,
When I think about joys and difficulties, I think the joy for me is getting to live life and do ministry with people, right? Because as Donnie was kind of alluding to, it's not really like a job, it's a way of life. And then, but so it's doing that with your church and getting a chance to like baptize people and marry people and bury people, right? And all of those things with the church. But then it's also living life in community, which in a way that I think is a little bit unique because of like what Donnie was saying too, people know who you are within the community. So like, I started up a conversation with the cashier at the local grocery store, and then found out her son died, and so that was kind of like this moment. And then we had we had a loss in our family, and that was a chance for her then to care for me and to care for my family too, a couple of years later. And so doing that kind of living life, I think for me the struggle, like I always frame things theologically, and I look at, like the deadly sins, and one of them is acedia. And acedia is what gets translated as sloth a lot of times, but it's not laziness. It's this sense of blah. And it's not just like it's not depression. It can be related, but it's different than depression. It's a sense of like, does my work matter? Does it mean anything? And that's like my deadly sin of choice, right? And so, I think that for me is always the struggle. Like, am I making a difference here? And like, how do you measure whether you're making a difference? And it's not just like the size of the community or whatever. I don't really get down on that, but I like to brag on the size of my community, right? It's only 1,800. But it's just that sense of like, am I making the right choices? Because in ministry, you can kind of choose to do anything, right? Like, what should I do on Tuesday morning? Should I go get a coffee at the grocery store? Should I like work on the sermon? What should I do? I can kind of choose to do anything. And so how do you know when you're making a difference for the kingdom and for the gospel? And you get these bright moments of God's resurrection in your life, right? That kind of keep you going on the trail, the breadcrumb trail. But that's for me the challenge.
Can I follow up with that? That question of whether you're making a difference or whether what you're doing is valuable, this acedia, that's a issue that pastors struggle with everywhere, right? So I'm sure that pastors here, specifically people pastoring or just serving in the small places, struggle with that. Probably most all of us to one degree or another, because you can't measure success with numbers in the small town in the same way that you can in a suburb or in a city. So do you have any advice or encouragement to pastors here who are struggling with that very thing, trying to measure their success in a place where you cannot measure success with numbers?
The crucifixion. New England doors have the cross and the Bible. It's the colonial door. And for me, almost every morning, I often look at that going, he died, his word, I got enough, I can go through the door, I just make it another day. Because it's success is a lie. And so for me, the crucifixion keeps me grounded. Yeah.
I think too, just recognizing that I think people have good intentions, but a lot of the sort of stuff that's out there and that you'll read and see on Twitter and all that kind of stuff can just be unhelpful, and just recognize that that it can be unhelpful. So you hear things like, how do we break the 200 barrier? I'm not saying that's a bad thing to say, but if your town's got 150 people, you probably ain't breaking the 200 barrier anytime soon, And so I get guys come going like, oh man, I only have 50 people. How many people in your town? 200. That's 25%, man. That you would be on the front of like Outreach magazine if you reached 25% of New York City. It's unbelievable. And so it's just watching for that stuff, because it's subtle. But you hear these numbers and you start thinking, oh, that's the number. I had to hit that number. And it's just maybe not even be reality for your community. And so, yeah, the gospel, as David said, being enough, but just kind of with that, kind of recognizing, and some of the stuff that's out there, for our particular context, it's just unhelpful to think about.
I have another one. I'd actually love to hear from Rick on this one, because you're in theological education, so you've thought a lot about how to prepare people for successful ministry, whatever that is. But one that's really been gripping me in the last 8 or 9 months as I've thought more about it is from Ephesians 3, where Paul's talking about the church, which is composed of Jew and Gentile. And it is meant, as it's composed of Jew and Gentile, the reason it is composed of Jew and Gentile folded together into one unified people of God, he says, is in order to display the manifold wisdom of God. Now that really gripped me as I started thinking about it, that the church is not, it's not simply proclaiming the manifold wisdom of God. It is the way it's constituted. It's like the thing itself, Jew, Gentile together, is displaying the manifold wisdom of God. And so I would propose another metric of success beyond numerical success, and that is see-through ability to the gospel. In other words, is your church, the way it's operating, the rhythms of its life, its composition, the people it's drawn to, does it have a flavor of the gospel? When people look at your church and the things it does and the way it is, can they see through it to the manifold wisdom of God? So now that can flip things on their head. It might mean that, one of the ways the manifold wisdom of God or the beauty of the gospel is embodied is that your church just develops a passion for the elderly and seniors. That started to happen in our church. We have some of our folks here who God has burdened them for folks who are struggling with senility and equipping their families. And we have people who volunteer at our senior center. And it's not been a coordinated effort. I think it's just the fruit of the gospel. When the gospel is proclaimed and embraced, then people start to live in a way that reflects it. So I think that's a measure of success. You can't measure it in the same way, but it's more beautiful, and it's not just for big churches either. Are you see through to the gospel, not just the words you proclaim, but the very nature of your church life together? But I'd love to hear from Rick as well.
Yeah, a couple points. I think this spectrum is the wrong one to think about. Either we're going to be successful, defining success outwardly, or we're going to be faithful. I think the deeper point Steve's pointing to, there has to be a fruitfulness to ministry, and that sometimes is hard to get a hand on, but it's got to be manifest. It's tangible. It is concrete. And lives are changed by virtue of it. So if you're seeing nobody come to know Jesus, that's a warning sign. But if you're thinking, and not many of you do, not many of us, think about the notches on our belts about how many conversions there are, and we go along and compare ourselves to everybody. On the other hand, to see the tangible fruits of the Spirit at work is a really important part of ministry. And you need to pray to that end, to be challenged to that end. Robert Putnam writes this famous book in the early 2000s, Bowling Alone, that we live in a lonely culture. People don't have people invested in their lives, like the testimonies you've seen here. These are really unusual. Whether you're in a small town or not, people live in a digital age as if they don't belong anywhere. They belong everywhere. So what does the person in the small town want to do? They want to go somewhere else. This is the mythology of our time in a digital age. It's better somewhere else. And the pastor, wherever they are, reminds us that God has put us in this place. And I'd say one more thing about vocation. How do you know you're called to a small town? I'd say that true about any vocation. Right? There's a sacredness to all vocations, and one of the things you need to understand in a place that knows you well, not only is the danger of being the Messiah of the town, but also not considering the sacredness of the vocations of those others in your town. Whether it's the firefighters, the first responders, the clerk at the grocery store, the bus driver, whoever. To value the dignity of others helps you to value your own vocation.
And I think it is too simplistic to say numbers don't matter, because we should all be praying for revival. I've known small town pastors who are coming toward the end of retirement and just phoning it in, and they're honestly lazy and not prayerful, and not expecting bigger things from God. Donnie is the pastor of a large church in a small town, and it's large because people are coming to know Jesus, and we should not be lazy. I think the danger of saying numbers don't matter is that we baptize placidity and laziness and sloth. So one way I think we should say it is we should long more and work harder for bigger and faster, and we should be more okay with slow and smaller. We should want it more and need it less. Because if we don't want it more, we're not asking God for what He wants to give us in many cases. If we need it too much, it's become an idol. We've baptized our culture's value of large and fast, and the gospel sometimes comes small and slow. So sometimes it comes big and fast. Sometimes it comes small and slow. We should be more okay with small and slow if that's what God wants us, because that's displaying something about the gospel too.
Well, thank you guys so much. We have 25 minutes left before the end of the day. We got a couple mics that are going to be coming around, so if you have a question for one or all of these guys, put your hand up in the air. Yep.
Hello? All right. There we go. So this is not necessarily directed to Donnie, but he got me thinking about it just as you started talking about how I saw that you were very practically minded, and you said something along the lines of like the people don't care that you know Greek and Hebrew, and that I think I really understood what you were saying there, that we don't want to flaunt our theological education and those things in front of people, but I also want to hear like clarify a little bit and kind of, because being in a small town, your time and resources are limited and you're tired and there's less people to help out, but what is a healthy place for theological education and kind of like where to spend some of your time in some of those things?
So let me just clarify too. I think we need like brilliant pastors and leaders who've done every course they could possibly do at an institution like this to go and to take small towns seriously, because there's a lot of whack job, nutcase churches in small towns, and we need all the good gospel ministry we can get. I was referring to, and I should have been more clear, there's a guy in our town who came to town, new in town. I knew what it was like to be new in town, so I welcomed him to town. His first, what he said to me was, do you read Greek? And I said, no. He said, well, you have no business doing God's ministry. That was his first comment. I was like, well, our friendship's off to a good start. And actually, in fact, he ended up getting fired from the church a year or so later. And a lot of people left the church, came to our church saying, with tears down their face, all he did every week was unpack Greek words, and we didn't understand what it meant, and we told him we didn't understand, and he just laughed at us. That's what I'm saying is just, we need so many good, faithful, smart, these guys are like Yoda smart. I'm so thankful that they're in small towns, right? That is amazing. We need more of that. But the more you know, the harder it is for you to have to fight to unpack those profound things in really simple ways. And that's what I was pushing on.
Let me just follow up by being a C student. I also find that having a Master of Divinity degree from an accredited institution gives me some credibility in New England, because we are in a highly educated region. And I don't remember much of my Greek or Hebrew, but it disciplined me to study and helps me feel comfortable with the commentaries. And I think what Donnie was saying is that we want to study, but throwing there's a danger to being arrogant in ministry and throwing around, dropping the Greek word in Moorhead City is probably not beneficial to the advancement of the gospel. Unless there's, again, weigh the heart, right? Weigh the heart. And education is a great gift, but it also puffs up. So I say get as much education. I got convicted about working on a doctorate, not because I think I can finish it, but because just I'm sitting here like, man, I don't want to be lazy. And so going to school makes you work harder.
One of the great forgotten virtues of ministry is curiosity. To be curious about the people that you minister to, but also to be really curious as a learner about the Bible. John Stott talks about living between two worlds, the world of Scripture and the world in which our feet are planted, and to be able to translate. But to translate means to be able to understand the ordinary language, the vernacular of the place you live in, to be able to communicate in the terms understandable. And and yet also not simply to be bound so tightly to that cultural context that you can't understand the way in which the Bible challenges it. And also baptizes it. That is, on occasion, there are really positive things you need to see. And so curiosity will lead you to be a lifelong learner. And the danger of much learning is that you think you do know it all. But reality is the more you know, the more you realize how much you don't know.
Okay, could I recommend a very old book for rural pastors called The Country Parson by George Herbert? Maybe some of you have read George Herbert's poetry. The famous poet, friend and acquaintance of John Donne. And a lot of people know George Herbert's poetry. Not as many people in our day know about The Country Parson, although 100 and 200 years after he wrote it, it was famous. It was being quoted many, many times. And it's a short book. I mean, you can maybe even find it free online, I'm not sure. But a lot of what he writes and talks about in The Country Parson is the importance of curiosity and knowing your people and knowing your place and knowing the customs and traditions of your town and your village so that they're bridges for the gospel. It's contextualization. It's what we've talked about all day. You know, it's like seeing what's there in front of you. I was at an academic conference last November, and there were four of us giving various papers, and one of the other presenters did this thing that just stunned me. I'd never seen it done before. Before he gave his presentation, I think he was maybe Inuit or ministered to Inuit peoples, and the conference was in Denver. Before he gave his paper, he just talked about the place where we were, where the hotel, the complex was, who owned that, which Native American peoples owned that place, and what treaty gave it to whoever, whenever. And it just was so stunning to me. It was like we were all these academic people talking about these ideas in this place, but we didn't know anything about the land on which we were sitting or the community. And it was all this abstract stuff, and he just, in about 2 minutes, because he had studied the history of this particular place, he unpacked where this land came from and who owned it. And when I just thought that's a metaphor, very often I think for ministry, we have these abstract ministry practices, and we kind of bring them from somewhere else and then work them out. But we need to see where we are. We need to know the history of our place, and it's like what these guys were saying in their talks. If you have eyes to see, you'll develop a heart to care, and you'll be curious about your local place and the customs of your place. And I just find that's incredibly important for ministry.
So, go ahead. Well, I just maybe would throw one more thing in there. I think, education, sometimes I think it's important to have that curiosity to study and, to find ways to bring that to bear in sermons and studies. But for me, it's all about humility, right? Like, that's what people want, is that authenticity and that humility. And humility in a Christian sense, it seems to me, has something to do with feeling that the most important and the most interesting thing about me is that I am in Christ and I am a child of God, right? And so when we kind of really live that out, there's an authenticity that's attractive to people. And oftentimes we use education to both stake out and then defend our sense of self and our sense of worth. And so when we do that, I think it's perceptible. People sense that as kind of like know-it-all or kind of looking down on them. But if we, in humility, bring the gifts and the opportunities we've had to serve them and to serve the kingdom, then I think people have respect for that.
Any other questions? Right here in the right.
Just wanted to say thank you for providing an environment like this. This is really sweet. One observation is that all of us who live in New England are doing a relative small city, small town ministry. So if you look at it on the global scale, Boston's small city. So I think all of us are in the same boat. I'm wondering if you could speak to and encourage us towards an element of ministry. As I look around the room, I see generational diversity here, but don't see much multi-ethnic diversity here. And if you could speak to those of us who are in a context that has a higher level of ethnic diversity, could you speak to us in ways that we can pray through and break through ways to reach and serve and love those who are different than we are?
A couple of thoughts to that end, Danny. I think churches need to build bridges with churches that are quite different. One of the points often noticed in cities, but not so much in small towns, is the churches you connect with often will reflect the relationships that are important to you. And if you are so involved in the denominational politics of what's going on in 3 states outside of where you are, rather than with the Lutheran church across the town or the Pentecostal church across the street or the black church, that will speak volumes in a small town. It speaks volumes in a large city also. And so I think one of the urgent realities for ministry, and I'd say this across the board, is the collaborative nature of ministry, to see your church not as the single outpost that has the gospel, but as a partner with many others. And it takes time. It takes time to build cross-cultural bridges, cross racial bridges, cross ethnic bridges. There's lots of really interesting things going on. So I don't want to be discouraging, but there's a history of cultural conflict that's part of the American story, the American narrative. It's part of the human narrative also, how we otherize the outsider. And so it's deep, it's profound, and it's dangerous. On the other hand, I would say be most concerned with the gospel. And it's the gospel that calls us to that ministry. It's not the culture that calls us to that ministry. So make sure it's missional in nature, just as a start.
I think, too, just appreciating the nuance. It's interesting. I mean, I grew up in this little town and that I'm in now, and it's very normal to have white church, black church, and all that, And in my head, when I started to think, years ago about, it'd be great to have diversity, honestly, in my head, what I meant was it'd be great if black people came to our white church. It was really just, it was challenging for me a few years ago when I started thinking, okay, that can't be the only definition of biblical, diversity. And so beginning to, as Richard said, to befriend local pastors, who are different than you, and work together and encourage each other. I mean, the hurricane ripped the roof off of a black church a few doors down from us, and for lots of reasons, they couldn't afford to fix it, but our church jumped in and helped raise a ton of money for it. And that wasn't so that their people would come to our church. It was so that we could say, hey, we think what you're doing is beautiful, and we're in your corner, and we're on the same team. Another thing that I realized was I was never quoting black people in sermons. I wasn't listening to black preachers. I wasn't following black people on Twitter. I wasn't reading books written by someone that wasn't white. And that is subconsciously, I think, doing damage. And so because it's subconsciously showing that I don't think I can learn from someone who's not like me. And so when I began to sort of run at that tension, we did begin to see things change, but I think we're a long way off. I think, as Richard said, culture just takes a long time to change. I mean, we don't even think about anything changing for 10 years. Whenever we think about something that needs to change, we think it's going to be at least 10 years. As Stephen said, it may be 100 years, but it didn't get this way overnight. But I think modeling some humility and beginning to work together is a real good start.
We have time for one more question. So, you guys have.
So in New England, most of our 1, 2, 3, 5 mainline denomination churches that are already there. I wonder if you could speak to how we can help those churches that are struggling with the gospel, with finances, with mission, with all sorts of things. Not to mention the Catholic churches and the Pentecostal churches that are struggling too. So if you want to speak to that, I appreciate it.
The first word of caution, no magic bullet. Case by case, town by town, pastor by pastor, church by church. So there are too many examples where dying churches just want to die. But there are other examples where dying churches want to find life and to be open to that. Why plant churches in a town that already has 5 other churches that are not doing so well? I think you have to answer that question differently in different towns. And so one wants to be careful of generalizing about every small town is just like every other small town. No. Relational savvy is required to know what the Proverbs call wisdom, to know when to speak into a situation and when to be silent. That is a peculiar skill set. So I would suggest in a place like New England that the Roman Catholic Church is really important. But post the sex abuse scandal of the 90s, the cultural ferment has turned on the institutional Roman Catholic Church. And congregations have, individuals have left in droves, but it's still their grandmother's church. And so they don't like it, but they like their grandmother, so they have this peculiar relationship. And in many mainline churches, it's the same. My grandparents went there. I don't believe any of it, but I like my grandparents. And it's the tension often that an outsider comes in and doesn't understand the great ironies in those relationships, the traditions, if you will. And so there are too many examples I can think of off the top of my head where church plant has come. They've used the mainline church in the afternoon on Sunday because no one else is there. And then finally they form some friendships, and before long, the churches merge. That's one model. It's pretty rare, but it has happened. And you have other conflict models, too many to count either, in that demographic in a place like New England. The church on the green in New England occupies a special place. Understanding the church on the green is a vital part of doing ministry in a place like New England.
I don't know if you've connected with Jim Harrell and Overseed Ministry. They have a table out here. But there's lots of wisdom there from Jim and the other folks, part of that ministry, for New England church revitalization. How to do it, what to avoid in doing it. It maybe be helpful to have a conversation with them at the end of the day as well.
I think just to throw it in there, something like this might be helpful. We've started saying for some time now, several years, every Sunday at the beginning, we'll just say, welcome, we're so glad you're here. And we say the same thing every week. We say there's so many great churches in our area. I mean, we're really just thankful you're here with us this morning. It's like we're drip feeding that all the time. So we want to model that. We don't think we're the only great church. We're not like, oh, we know that you finally arrived. No. There's so many great churches in our community. And those types of things over time, I think, can help,
That's good, thank you. So we have 5 minutes left, and I was wondering if one or two of you just wanted to share, in the last 5 minutes we have, what is one piece of advice or encouragement that you think small town pastors here today, or ministry leaders, or elders, or lay leaders need to hear going back to their small places?
I go back to the verse, Jesus said, I will build my church. And it's been a resting point for me in so many ways, because I screw it up a lot, and it's hard, and but he said, I'm building my church, and that's a pretty good place to put your head on the pillow at night.
I think just be thankful. Look for things to be thankful for. It's so easy to come to something like this and think about all the things that aren't going right. Just go home and just say, man, God, thank you for all the evidences of grace. Look at you. You're working in spite of all the things I wish we could do differently, you know?
Yeah, I think you got to be convicted and you got to be humble at the same time. And I'm kind of still back. I'm a little slower. I'm on this previous question still, because like our church is sort of like one of the establishment churches in town, right? We were founded in 1888, so that's pretty close to the beginning for Kansas. And there is a new church plant in town, right? And part of their thing is that like nobody was doing the gospel before we showed up. And so, yeah, but...
Well, now you know. I mean, now you know that you guys weren't doing the gospel.
Well, see, I wasn't there yet when they... But so, I think you got to... And so I think about this previous question, but with this last question too, right? Like, I think you got to kind of just work where you can, have, the humility to kind of get in there, move the church forward by nudges, and kind of just equip people and love people. And so have the humility to get in there, have the conviction that Jesus is real, right? That Jesus is at work in you and in this church, in this community. And it looks different over here in that new church plant than it does in our hymn singing church, but we just keep pushing forward with the goodness of the gospel and the love of God. So I don't know, something like that, but yeah.
Let me just, Don Guthrie's written a book called Resilient Ministry. It's well worth picking up. It's a massive study of why pastors burn out. The overwhelming reason pastors burn out is because they're not connected with anybody else. Put that together with the reality that men in the baby boomer generation have no friends. We're not talking about one friend, no friends on average that really know them.